When we hear about apologetics, we think of debates, arguments, giant piles of essays and books. What about stories? Wait, stories? How do stories relate to apologetics? Stories are a universal staple for every society in history. There's a reason why good stories, whether real or fiction, will outlast and outlive the people who first told them. They resonate with us on some level, capable of giving meaning, a sense of identity, happiness, inclusiveness, and reasons for living, working, and fighting. But for every good story, there is also a bad one. They're bad stories not because there's nothing good in them, rather it's because they take good things and distort them. The same is seen today in our postmodern context. Nowadays, people aren't asking about intellectual arguments for Christianity as much as people used to. Instead, people are asking what we'd call emotional arguments and objections, and stories appeal to those very well. So how do we do that? C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, two legendary authors, both give some insight into this. C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. What some people may not know is what his intention in writing the Chronicles were. He calls it a myth to reflect what we call the true myth, which is in reference to the story of Jesus. Tolkien, who authored The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, affirmed a similar idea when he called us sub-creators who mirror our creator, whether consciously or subconsciously, and echo the supreme story. To repeat what Tolkien had said, the stories that we make reflect the story. In Lewis's case, Chronicles of Narnia explicitly and allegorically reflect Christianity. Like Aslan, obvious allegory for Christ. Tolkien, even though he hated allegory, still considered his story to have several allusions and applications. Lord of the Rings, for example, has a lot of these with countless allusions and subliminal references to Christianity. Throughout the main trilogy is the theme of hope in the face of despair and good triumphing suddenly over strong darkness. For example, Sam and Frodo walking through the plains of Mordor, where Sam sees a bright star, light and high beauty beyond the reach of evil, shows that in the thickest and strongest domains of all evil and darkness, hope and light and good suddenly break through. As Tolkien described it, it's a eucatastrophe. What if I told you that the gospel is a story? The reality is the Bible is not a rule book or a systematic theology. It does have rules in theology, but it's not strictly those types of books. The Bible is a collection of 66 books, all with different genres and literary styles compiled together to tell one story. The true myth, as Lewis described it, and the epitome of eucatastrophe, as Tolkien called it. It's where all hope seemed lost and darkness reigned supreme on the earth, until God himself broke through in the most unexpected way, coming as a man and dying, only to be resurrected. As Tolkien put it, the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The story begins and ends with joy. So how does all of that relate to apologetics? If you saw my video explaining the presuppositional method, I talked about the twofold method of dismantling the unbeliever's worldview with questions and then leading them to Jesus. Well, stories accomplish that. Everyone is living in and by a story, whether it's the story or a story that they've adopted or made for themselves to make sense of reality. And as apologists, we step into those stories and show its shortcomings and its faults, which is where questions come into play. But we don't just leave them there. We reach out to the story that is in the Bible and show where it succeeds. We show how the story gives meaning, a sense of identity, happiness, inclusiveness, and reasons for living, working, and fighting. There is a time for debates and long books and papers, but there's always a time for stories.